Well, good morning, everyone. As we enter our guests as they arrive, we will kick off and start this wonderful morning with Luca, who is here, Carmignani, a beautiful Italian name that I need to practice, obviously. And so we're welcoming you to the Water Efficient Landscape Workshop. I believe we're celebrating our 12th year this year. And as you know from being here in the past, your hosts are Rosa Olays, Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator, and myself from Western Municipal Water District. And Rosa has a few items, Master Gardener related items to tell us about this morning. Rosa?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Glad to see you. Before we get started, I want to mention a few of our Master Gardener events throughout Riverside County. Master Gardeners offer science-based information, advice, and education to the public on gardening and horticulture. Our information tables, Ask the Master Gardener, are often available at farmers markets throughout the county, Riverside, Corona, Temecula, Palm Springs. You can find Master Gardeners there. On the first Saturday of the month, we have Riverside Corona Resource Conservation District, where we have an information table. The public is welcome to attend. There are workshops and you can tour the 3-acre demonstration garden. We are also going to have a plant sale coming up October 21st and 22nd. That's going to be at the Riverside Grow Lab, and we hope to see you there. We will have Master Gardeners available to answer your gardening questions. We also have a garden day at the UCR Palm Desert campus on October 21st. So if you can't make the Riverside plant sale, I believe we're going to have a plant sale out in Palm Desert, so you can visit us there. Thank you.
That's great. For today's workshop, if you would please enter your gardening questions, or actually let's stick to the topic, firescaping your property, into the chat feature, and we'll submit them to the speaker, Luca, at the end so that he can help us all do a better job of firescaping. And Rosa?
Okay, so Luca is a UC ANR fire advisor based at South Coast Research and Extension Center in Riverside. He collaborates with universities, agencies, and organizations to provide science-based solutions for wildfire preparedness and create fire-resilient communities across Southern California. His research focuses on fire risk associated with wildland-urban interface, vegetation, and structures. Previously, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Berkeley Fire Research Lab at the University of California, Berkeley. He graduated from the Joint Doctoral Program between the University of California, San Diego, and San Diego State University in Engineering Sciences after obtaining his bachelor's and master's degrees in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Pisa, Italy. So, thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Let's see, can you all see the screen?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Lisa and Rosa, for organizing this. Really appreciate it. And I'm Luca Carmignani, and this morning I was going to talk about how to create a fire-resilient and beautiful landscape, because sometimes we hear like contrasting opinions. So how can we do this? And yeah, just as Rosa mentioned, I'm a fire advisor. I'm based in Irvine, but I cover multiple counties: San Diego, Orange, LA, and Riverside. And if you put the acronym, like the initials together, they give you this cool acronym, Solar Counties. And I work on wildfire preparedness, mostly on home hardening, defensible space, and other strategies to adapt to fires. And I was in the Berkeley Fire Research Lab for a couple of years. I've been a fire advisor for a little over a year now. And in case you didn't get it, I'm from Italy, from my accent or my name, and that's where I got my master and bachelor degrees. So this is the overview of the presentation and the topics that we're gonna see today. We're gonna start from seeing how structures burn during a fire, because that's gonna give us an idea about how we can better prevent that. And we'll see the strategies related to home hardening and defensible space. And then we'll talk about some of the principles for creating a fire resilient landscape. And we'll finish with some practical guidelines as well. So probably many of you have heard the term fire resilience. And honestly, before even defining it, I think it's worth to mention a few things. So you probably all know that Southern California, as other parts of the state and the nation, has a fire adapted ecosystem. So what this means is that fire is part of the landscape. Could be different from region to region depending on the vegetation, but still fire is part of the cycle. So the main issue though is that whenever these fires happen during strong wind events, for example Santa Ana winds, these fires can be really, really hard to manage or suppress, so they can become really destructive and spread really fast. And also with the additional challenges due to climate changes, for example, extreme heat events or extreme droughts, these conditions could get worse. And in Southern California, we have a diverse population and also like a large population. Just to give you an idea, in the counties that I serve, there are more than 7 million people that live in communities at risk. So to go back to the term fire resilience, the idea is not to avoid every fire, but is to have fires without bad consequences. And how do we do that? By preparing for these fires. And this is an image of, this is the map of Riverside County, more or less. And what I wanted to show was the fire history of this region. So if we just look at 20 years back, we have all of these fires in these regions. But what I really wanted to show is that if you go 100 years back, basically the map gets completely full with areas burned by fires, except for like the eastern regions and like the desert areas. We have even urban areas that have been covered by fire. So this kind of tells you that it's not a matter of if, but it's more a matter of when a fire will come to your area. And if it's not direct flames, it could be smoke, and other issues connected to fires. So it's very important to prepare for it. And let's see how homes burn during a fire. So we have three main mechanisms, and we have flame contact and embers and radiant heating. So flame contact is kind of intuitive because it happens whenever we have a path of fuels, and with fuel we mean anything that could burn. Could be a plant, could be a furniture, could be a shed. And basically the fire finds enough fuel to reach the house. And so that's called usually direct flame contact. And then we have embers. Whenever you burn something, if you're sitting in front of a campfire, you see all of those tiny particles that fly up. And those particles can be really big too. even like small branches, and can travel for long distances. In case of strong wind, they can travel up to 7 miles from the front of the fire. So, that's very, very important to prepare for this storm of embers during a fire. And then we have radiant heating. And radiant heating is something that is a little bit more tricky to visualize. But for example, when you're sitting in front of a fire and you feel that heat, even though you're far away from it, that's the radiant heating. So if you have something that is burning, like next to your house, for example, a shed or, a big tree, that heat could be enough to ignite a component of the house. And we will see more of this later. So keep in mind that these three mechanisms always happen at the same time. There's not one or the other that is more important. Whenever you have a fire, you have all of these three. It's just easy for now to divide these mechanisms because we can prepare in different ways depending on this mechanism. And for example, for flame contact, what we want to do is to break the fire paths. And we will see in a second what this means. And usually it's done by implementing a defensible space. And then to reduce the vulnerability to embers that could fly into vents or ignite anything that is like close to the structure, we usually talk about home hardening, which basically means improving the different components to make them resistant to ignition. And then usually for radiant heating, we want to reduce the fuel around the structures. And again, all of these three things happen at the same time. So that's why it's important not just do defensible space or home hardening, but to have a comprehensive approach. So this is an example of a fire that happened last year in July in Texas. And what happened here is that the fire started from the, oh, you cannot see my mouse. Can you see my mouse? Okay, so the fire started from the road, and unfortunately, this is a very common scenario also in Southern California. And then it spread through grass and small vegetation through this community. And what happened is that when it reached this area, there were like all of these fences from these houses that were exposed to, they had all of this small vegetation next to it. So the fire was able to jump from the grass and ignite the fence. And so what happens is that in this way, you have the whole perimeter of the structures, that is the fence, that is on fire. So in this case, you can see that the fire was able to jump the fence and creeping towards the house. So this is a great example of flame contact. And also another very important thing is that you see here, the fire is going from the fence and, heating up the shed and eventually catches on fire. And in the shed, you have a lot of flammable materials, you have tools, so in less than 10 minutes, the shed was burning. And what happened is that you have radiant heating, embers, and direct flame contact. So if you see here, the shed basically ignited the house. And you see the edges of the roof are ignited, and you see a little bit of smoke coming out of the vents. So that means that the fire is inside of the roof. And in that case, very likely the house gets lost. So I mentioned the fire that was jumping from the ground to the fence and so on. So usually we call this kind of situation ladder fuels because, just think about a fire climbing up a ladder. The fire goes from a lower level to a higher level. So this could be from grass to a shrub and shrub to a tree, for example. But this is not only for vegetation. It can happen, as we saw in the video, also with in an urban environment, for example, from grass to fence and from fence to a shed and shed to house. So what we want to do is to break these paths for the fire, and that can be horizontal, like we saw the fire spreading from the road through the community, with grass and small shrubs, and this vertical path that can bring the fire up and then eventually get to the attic or a roof of the house. And in that way, it's really, really hard to save the structure. And this is another case, and much closer to us. This was again last year in May of 2022 in Laguna Niguel. And this was the coastal fire, and it was pretty much different from the fire that we just saw. And what happened here is that at the bottom of a canyon, there was an issue, a power issue that started a fire. And in perspective, so the fire from this point to the community took less than 2 hours. So it was really, really fast. So in these cases, you don't get much time to prepare. That's why it's important to prepare in advance. And this community also did a great job in terms of defensible space. They had their fences, you know, and then they had an area with ground cover vegetation. In this case was ice plant. They removed some of the fuel in the initial slope. They had a trail road. So overall, they were in good shape for defensible space. The problem, though, is that some of the houses probably did not have vents or other components that were ready for, that could prevent embers from flowing in. So what happened is that what happened is that you see all of these houses that ignited, and no vegetation is burning around them. There's no really like flame contact in this case, but you see all of these roofs starting like igniting and catching on fire. So this shows that the fire started from probably gutters or entered into the vents and then ignited the material there. So this shows you that doesn't matter if you only do defensible space, if you don't do home hardening, it's not going to be enough. And also here we have another topic that we've seen, which is the effect of the slope. So, the heat tends to rise. And so the fire, usually if it's on a slope, can preheat the fuel ahead of it and accelerate. So that's why in those cases, the fires can spread really, really fast. And at the same time, the embers have sort of a chimney effect, so they can get pushed towards the community on top and create a storm of embers. So, and keep in mind that these embers can travel for long distances. So now that we've seen the destruction, let's talk about a little bit more positive things, how we can prevent this. And in particular, the strategies of home hardening and defensible space. So as I mentioned before, home hardening, the concept is to improve the building components that you have to reduce the risk of ignition in case of a fire. And we have structures of all kinds. Homes are built in different times, they have different styles and so on. So it's very important to understand that the priorities might change depending on your situation. And we'll see more this in the next slide. And in terms of defensible space, we don't just want to reduce the fire hazard around our home, which implies reducing the fuel around some critical areas, but also maintain that space. Because just designing the first time and just letting it go is not going to work. And also, if you live in more rural areas, it's very important to consider the access that emergency responders would have. So how do we prioritize our actions for home hardening? Well, as I mentioned, houses can vary a lot, but in general, we have some components that are pretty common to every houses. And we've seen how embers, for example, can be important. And what is the largest surface of your house? The roof. So the roof protects you from water, from sunlight, but it also collects all of the embers. So if you have debris or leaves or any dry material that could accumulate, for example, at roof intersections, if you have a chimney or in gutters, it's very, very critical that you clean those areas. And in that way, if the embers land on them, they're not going to ignite anything. And if you think about a roof is usually like a large area, if you have to burn a piece of paper, a flat piece of paper, you don't burn it from the middle because that would take forever. You burn it from the edges. And in the same way, the roof burns better if the fire starts from the edges. And that's why you need to protect the gutters and make sure that they're clean. And if you have, for example, a fence that is attached to the structure, we've seen how the fire can burn through the fence. So we want to break this path. And that can be done by putting a non-combustible gate or a non-combustible section. And usually just the first 5 feet can make a huge difference. And if you have a fence that is very close to the house, you might be worried about the eave. If you don't have a fence, probably the eave is going to be fine. But again, it depends on if you have a shrub or vegetation. And if you have vegetation, for example, underneath a window, if this burns, the flames will shatter the glass. So you're creating this big opening for embers and flames to get in. So that's why we recommend not to have vegetation right underneath windows or in front of vents or in other critical areas. And not everybody has a deck, but if you do, it's tempting to store things underneath, or sometimes it happens that leaves and other debris accumulate. And these areas are critical for ignition because the embers can land in there too. So if you have a deck, make sure to keep it clean and free of materials that could easily ignite. And the other parts, this is a priority scale, but again, it really depends on your situation. These are all important components, but this is just to give you an idea about, different priorities. And in terms of defensible space, one thing that I wanted to mention, if you have vents, traditional vents usually have mesh screens that are 1/4 of an inch. And you have 2 options for vents, and they can really make a huge difference. You can either retrofit your vents by replacing the screen with a metal mesh that is between 1/8 and 1/16 of an inch. Or you can upgrade your vents with ember resistant or fire resistant vents, and they're available on the market. They're not super expensive. Usually for like $50 you can get them, and they, you can have more peace of mind in that case. And in terms of defensible space, as I mentioned, we want to remove the fire paths, and we've seen the image before, not only horizontal, but also vertical. And we want to prevent emissions that are close to the structure and maintain the vegetation. Managing and maintaining the vegetation is very important. And again, if you live in a rural area, you want to make sure that the fire responders would have an accessible area. And we'll see a couple of recommendations in a second. You probably heard about different zones for defensible space. That's usually something that people refer to. And traditionally in California, there have been 2 zones. Zone 1 that goes up to 30 feet from your house, and zone 2 that goes from 30 to 100 feet. So in Southern California, not everybody has zone 2. I feel it's pretty rare compared to other parts of the state, unless you live in a rural area or you are a millionaire. But yeah, just in case, even if it's not yours, it might be like in your neighbor's property or HOA or community. So even if it's not directly yours, you should still consider it as a defensible space zone, and maybe you can work together with other people on that area. And then there's also a new zone called Zone 0 that has been introduced, is in the process of being introduced, and it might come into effect next year. And it's called Zone 0, and it goes from 0 to 5 feet from your house. And the perimeter, for example, would include a deck. And this zone is very, very critical to prevent ignition. So in some areas, for example, in Orange County, the fire authority already requires to have that zone 0 clear of flammable things, but the state is gonna mandate it too over the next few months. So why is this zone 0 so important? Well, if you think about embers, it's hard to visualize the amount of embers unless you've seen it. And during a fire, because it's literally like a storm. And when these embers are coming, what happens is that they do accumulate around the home in a similar way that leaves do, with wind. They start, rotating or something, then they accumulate in some corners. So the same thing happens to embers. So if you have, debris or other things that can burn in these corners, very easily they're gonna be ignited. And you can have, this firefighter is trying to put out all of the different fires, but you can see that it can get pretty overwhelming very quickly. And you're not gonna have enough firefighters to put out these fires around every home. So you want to work on the 0 to 5 foot zone to make sure that there's nothing that could create a fire and then eventually affect the exterior walls. Because what you see here, they're right next to the walls. And also what do you see here is mulch, and mulch burns, as we'll see in a second. So it's not really recommended to have it right to the exterior walls of the structure. And it's not just mulch. You can have, these pictures are from one of my colleagues, Jana Valakovic. She took them after the Marshall Fire in Colorado that started December 30th, 2021. So it was a full winter. And what happened is that, for example, here you see how this small shrub caught on fire, and the fire found its way to this vent and probably direct flames or embers. So if you have anything on the other side, this could be any sort of vent, a foundation vent, or a dryer vent. If you find something else on the other side, it's gonna burn and start the fire from the inside of the home. And on this other case, you have this little tree that was right next to the house and somehow caught on fire. So it directly exposed the eave to the fire. And again, if you have to ignite the roof, it's easier to do it at the edge. So in this case, that's what happened. And mulch, yes, it does burn, and especially with the finer material, but pretty much all mulches can burn. And the problem is that, the fire might not spread really fast, but if you have it, for example, next to a fence or to an exterior wall, it basically can ignite these other components. And then we've seen once the fence is ignited, you have the whole perimeter and could ignite other things next to it. So it's very, very important to remove or avoid placing mulch next to in the first 5 foot of the home, or for example, next to a fence. Zone 1 is the one that goes from 5 to 30 feet. And in here, what we want to do is to break the fire path. And we've seen not only the vertical and horizontal. So this is an image of a house that was saved during a fire. And even though they had pretty much open landscape all around them, this is a pretty risky situation, but they didn't have any large combustible furniture, sheds, or vegetation that was like very close in this 30 feet area. So the fire didn't make it right next to the structure. So this house was saved. And these are pictures from the coastal fire, after the coastal fire in Laguna Niguel. And again, these houses didn't have zone 2, which is the one that goes up to 100 feet, but it was still part of the HOA. So they still had a fuel modification plan, and they had this ground cover. It was ice plant, which, by the way, can burn. It doesn't spread the fire really fast, but it can still burn because ice plant has a lot of that material in the understory, so that can burn really well. And then on the other side of the community, they had this area where they started. Here they had all acacia shrubs, and they burned completely. And then they started this part of the community where they had this fuel modification project for fire safety, and it didn't burn during a fire. Could have been also because of the effect of firefighters, but it kind of shows you that it's important to reduce the fuel in these areas. And if you live in a rural area, or the closest fire department is not very close, it's very important to make sure that you have accessible routes for fire responders. These could mean clearing up your driveway, or making sure that your property have turnarounds and vertical clearance. And to give you an idea, a fire truck usually needs about 13 feet of vertical clearance to drive by. So if you have a tree with lower branches, you might want to trim those. And if you have resources on your property, could be like a water source or important buildings that need attention somehow, it's very, very important to put reflective signs with key information. Reflective because at least you can see them better in smoky conditions, and with key informations because you have to keep in mind that if a fire happens, it might the fire responders might be from a total different area. They might not be from your local fire department. They might have no idea about what's going on in your property. So if you have these signs with key information, for example, turnaround, water tank, and so on, it can really make a difference. And having enough space around the structures would allow them to park their equipment and defend it. If it's too risky, they're not going to be able to defend it, and they'll have to skip the property. So that's not what we want. And so now let's switch to some principles for creating a fire resilient landscape. So what we want to do is we want to arrange plants and vegetation with enough spacing to create breaks for the fire. So in that way, if it spreads, it's not going to be able to reach the structure. And this implies planting away from the structures, or not necessarily too far from it, but away from critical areas. For example, vents, windows, and eaves. And you also want to maintain those plants healthy. So, irrigated is if needed, pruned, removing all the dead material, including the understory. And if you have to choose landscaping material, it's good to get a fire-resistant one. And we'll see some examples now. So this is just to give you a visualization of what could happen in a situation like this. You have a little house and you have a lot of vegetation, you have shrubs, you have a tree, you have, a plant right underneath the window. So what would you do in this case? We don't want to create a moonscape. We don't want to remove everything. We want to make it safer. So for example, in this case, by trimming the lower branches of the tree and removing the ladder fuels underneath the tree, you're already making a huge improvement. And then creating more spacing between plants and removing the plants like in critical areas, by still keeping vegetation, you can improve your you can reduce the fire risk significantly in this way. So what are the recommendations for zone 0, that 0 to 5 foot zone where we don't want to have ignition? So this means that we shouldn't have any combustible material, and this could be mulch, shrubs, but again, not only plants and vegetation, but also trash cans or, tools that could possibly burn. And gravel or stones are a good option for this area. And if we have a fence that is attached to the structure, we want to remove or replace at least the first 5 feet with a non-combustible section or a non-combustible gate. And there are a few options. It could be metal, it could be other materials that don't burn well. And we also want to check all the vulnerable locations in this zone 0. It could be under a deck, It could be an inside corner. It could be other areas where embers or leaves can accumulate as well. And these are some examples of this zone 0. You have here is like straightforward, it just with concrete, and so you play it safe, let's say. And then on the right here, we have gravel. And you can see that they still have mulch here, but it just separated from the gravel. So in this way, you don't have the mulch that is getting too close to the house. And this also, by the way, helps with this zone 0 approach, you kind of help with moisture issues or water damage to the exterior sides of the exterior walls. And these are other examples of zone 0. Here you have some gravel, some concrete, and so on. But here was also interesting that you have some vegetation, but check the vegetation here. First of all, these are succulent plants, and these are spaced from the exterior walls. They're not right next to it, and they're spaced from each other, and they're not right in front of the vents. So creating this staggered approach can work pretty well. And keep in mind that the final regulations for zone 0 are not out yet, and it's not clear if they're going to allow plants or not, but very likely they're going to allow something like this, where it's pretty safe from a fire perspective. In zone 1, the 5 to 30 feet, usually the motto that you hear is lean, clean, and green. And because what you don't want is to have any dead material or any dry vegetation that could burn and create these paths for the fires. So what you can do is, for example, increase the spacing between the different plants, and of course maintain what you have. This could imply irrigating, pruning, right sun exposure, all of the maintenance practices that you can think of. And if you have trees and shrubs, like another thing you could do, depending on the species, is trimming the lower branches. And for shrubs, the ones that are right next to the ground. And for trees, for example, if you have a tree that is on top of the roof, you want to have usually a 6-foot clearance from the branches that are overhanging. And if you have sheds or wood piles, if you can, you should move them far away from the home. And sheds are a little bit tricky because sometimes they can just be, too big to move or too heavy to be moved. And in that way, what you can do is to use a similar approach to what you do for home hardening. So basically, you're like, okay, this shed, I cannot move it. I'm going to make sure that there's not going to be any ladder fuels, or if it has vents, the vents are, retrofitted to make sure that the embers are not going to ignite that shed, or other flames are going to ignite it. And these are some ideas. This one on the left is actually from one of my colleagues, another fire advisor, Barb Wolfson. And, they live close to an open space. So they didn't need a lot of vegetation necessarily in their yard, but definitely it's a big risk if a fire comes here. So they created this patio with a metal gazebo, and it's pretty let's say dry landscape, but it's still pretty nice. And you have all the vegetation next to it. And then on the right, this is a little bit more drought. I guess they're both pretty drought tolerant. And this is a little bit more mixed landscape, and you have mulch and so on, but you can see that the plants are kind of separated and you don't have a lot of continuity. And for zone 2, the concepts are similar to zone 1. You want to break these potential fire paths. You want to decrease the density of trees and shrubs if you can, and make sure that you have access to those plants to maintain them. And also that access will be very useful for the fire responders. And if you have annual grasses, mow them like underneath for 4 inches in height. and remove invasive plants that could spread, or if you don't have them, don't plant them in that zone that could really like create a fire hazard, because usually invasive plants compete with the local vegetation, and also they can have like different cycles and they can dry. I don't know, like one very example is mustard or other invasive grasses that can create discontinuity of fuel and for the fire to reach a structure. And again, this is zone 2 might not be something that is that you own or you necessarily have, but you can probably work with your neighbors or with your community, or all sort of HOAs and so on, to make sure to work on this area as well. What about trees? So nobody tells you to remove trees. The only thing that you have to do is to be careful if you do have trees to certain things. For example, in this image, you see that the branches are overhanging, and this is an issue for multiple reasons. The branches could break during a fire, creating a damage to the roof or other components, and then allowing the fire to go in. The branches also might directly burn, creating a path for the fire. Or in general, you might have a lot of litter and dead leaves that end up in the gutter. And you can see here that the gutter is probably pretty full, because you see this water damage here that it's coming out of this side instead of going down here. So probably this gutter is pretty full. And so what you would do in this situation is remove the branches that are in direct contact with the roof and create some vertical clearance. And in that way, you can keep your tree, but improve your situation a lot. And then in this case, for example, this shrub probably would have to be removed because it's right in front of the window. So if it catches on fire, it will shatter the glass, and is right underneath the tree, creating this fuel ladder. So in this case, you want to remove the shrub, but you can totally keep the tree. So yeah, with trees, you have to be careful about not creating ladder fuels. So how do we interpret the guidelines for zone 1 and zone 0 and zone 1? So in zone 0, even though the guidelines are not out there yet, it seems that it's going to be possible to have some ground cover, for example, less than 3 inches in height, or some small plants that are less than 16 inches. And what you want to do is to make sure that these plants are separated from the exterior walls. They don't get, they don't touch them, and they're separated from each other and away from vents. And then you have a setback zone, you probably like, between 5 and 10 foot, where you have some this vegetation that can be a little bit taller. And then for trees, usually there's no restrictions on their height or their structure, but you want to, if possible, place them, between 10 and 30 feet away from the house. And if you do have them already, again, just there are some things that you can do to improve your situation without having to remove the trees. And the farther away you go from the house, the less strict the regulations come. But keep in mind that it's good to keep plants in islands, and in that way, you're breaking that continuity. So if we look at it, the same slide from the top, you have these small plants in zone 0 that are like very separated and they're tiny. And then you have these growing small shrubs, and then you have some trees. And then the farther you go, you have these islands and other types of vegetation. So this is an image it's a view of the headquarters of the Master Gardeners in Sonoma County. And this looks beautiful, like the landscape. You can see that the plants are, sort of separated here. You have these islands that look amazing, but there are some issues here, and what could be improved. I don't know if anybody wants to try saying it, or in the chat. I'll give 10 seconds, otherwise I'll relieve the answers. All right. I'll say it. So these areas that are close to the structure are at risk. And why? Well, here you have trees, and this is probably a vine that is right next to the roof. And you might say, well, the roof has ceramic tiles. Is that a problem? Because tiles don't burn, but the problem is that tiles might have debris underneath it, or they might have like a plywood sheet underneath it, and that can burn. So if you keep exposing a tile roof to flames for a little bit, you might still gonna burn it. So it doesn't matter if tiles don't burn, you're still gonna be able to burn the roof. And here on this side, you can see, and this other side, you can see that the mulch is right next to the structure, and the trees are very close. So by simply acting on this zone 0, you can already improve the situation without doing any crazy changes of the landscape. So let's finish now with some practical guidelines. And, we all want certain things when we're designing the landscape in our house or, community. For example, we do want to have beauty and harmony in the yard. And how can we do that? Well, we can work on the focal points, for example, color and shape, while still creating separation between buildings and vegetation and other things that could burn. We all want to feel sheltered and protected in our yard. How can we do that? Maybe use stone walls, non-combustible seating, or arbors without vegetation, or arbors with vegetation that are just away from the structure. Those are all good options. And we want to arrange plantings in groups. So what can we do? We can do that, it's fine, but we want to check for fuel ladders and make sure that we have both that horizontal and vertical separations between the different groups. And how do we satisfy the requirement of having eye-catching details? That's very nice to have. Well, again, we can work on the focal points, starting from the important ones, for example, the ones that you see from inside the building or by approaching the building, and we can focus on those. And again, we don't want to see ugly stuff. We don't want to see like the meter, the gas meter, or other pipes. How can we hide that in a safe way? And maybe we can use non-combustible art. We can use like metal art, fountains, other stone art that are not gonna burn. And I know it's very tempting to fill open spaces with plants, and it's very tempting, but from a fire perspective, it's less is better. So and also you want to plant, you want to have plants that you have time and resources to maintain it. And so, for example, you have enough water and time for pruning it and keep it in a certain way. So don't overdo it. And what are the criteria for selecting plants? Are these important? And then the answer is yes. And some of these criteria that you should keep in mind is what will happen to that plant. Will that plant become very large? So that affects the place where you're planting it. Or will it thrive where you plant it? Or will it get, pretty dry and have a lot of that material? So maybe it's not the best location, and will have enough sun exposure and so on. And how much maintenance does it require? Do I have enough time to, do it? And because if not, it might become like a fire hazard. So another issue is like, is it an invasive plant? Is it something that is gonna spread all over and create like the fuel continuity or not? So these are all aspects to keep in mind when you're selecting plants. And as you've noticed, I did not really mention the species. And the reason is that there are some species that burn better than others, but it's not just about the species. The placement and maintenance are critical and probably more important than the species itself. For example, if you have a shrub that has a lot of that material that could create a fire risk, what you can do is to remove all of these dead branches and clean up like the lower branches. And in this way, even if this plant might burn, you already improved the situation a lot. And keep in mind that all plants eventually will burn depending on the conditions. And also a lot of recommendations that you find out there are not really based on scientific testing. So it's hard to, find common plant lists, for example, that take into account different aspects. And again, you want to consider the understory and avoid ladder fuels. And one of the famous trees that is not very safe is palm trees. And the reason is that in palm trees, you have a lot of that material that could easily catch on fire. Just by removing them and maintaining them, you can improve the situation a lot. And the 4th of July, and you can see how basically once the palm tree is ignited, it's pretty much impossible to put out, and it burns like crazy. And what happens, all of this dead material drops on the house. You can see the roof is already on fire. All of the area around the house is already on fire. So this is why it's very, very important to keep the palm trees clean of that material. And if you can avoid them, please do. And in terms of mulch, and we shouldn't have any mulch within the first 5 feet of the house and other flammable components, for example, a fence or a shed. And usually the larger sized chips are better options, but keep in mind that all of them burn and burn pretty well, actually. So especially in windy conditions. So what you want to do is that you can still use mulch because it has a lot of benefits, for example, for drought tolerance and so on. But maybe you want to separate the landscape in mulched islands, or by creating, for example, a gravel pathway, or a separation of some kind. And I'm almost done. I promised this we've seen in the second video about the coastal fire, how slope is important. And the concept here, these are guidelines from Cal Fire. And the concept is that the steeper the slope, the larger the spacing between plants should be. And the reason is that, you've seen how fire can accelerate along slopes. So the length of the flame can reach farther away plants. So you want to make sure to space them more depending on the slope. And I can just mention this. Unfortunately, we have a lot of cool landscapers that are doing a lot of work for drought and creating new landscaping, but there's still some work to do in terms of fire safety. These are pictures from the Sunset magazine in May 2023, and these are very drought tolerant landscapes. You have mulch, small plants, but you see here next to the walls, you have all of these plants, all of this mulch, and that's not a good practice. And on the right, you have all the plants where they shouldn't be in zone 0. And you have them in front of the window and, in areas that could burn and create problems for the roof, eaves, windows, and so on. So how can landscapers support fire adaptation? Where definitely it's important to identify the critical areas and the vulnerable locations and work on the new look for that zone 0, and use, for example, non-combustible art or other focal points strategies, and promote landscapes that are easier to maintain. And so I just wanted to conclude. And so what are the key takeaways of this fire presentation? Fire is part of the California ecosystems. So ideally, we don't want to avoid every fire. We want to have fires without bad consequences. So it's very, very important to prepare to avoid these critical losses. And home hardening and defensible space give you two great strategies to do that. And when they're combined, they can really, really save your house. And plant spacing and maintenance is more important than a lot of other aspects of it. So that's very important to keep in mind. And always start from the house, the structure, and work your way outwards. Because at the end of the day, that's the part that you want to protect. And oh, before we finish, we have a quick poll. I don't know if Lisa, if you can send it out, just like a few questions about the presentations. The answer should be anonymous. So if you hated it and you say, I'll never know who that was.
Here is the first poll. On a scale from 1 to 10, how useful was the content of this presentation?
I guess I'll answer too. I'll get it out of the screen. Oh, were there more questions? Just one?
We have one question from Julie in the chat.
Oh, by the way, sorry, I forgot. Well, at this point, if we're finishing, I would like to thank you all for your attention. Know this was a long presentation with a lot of information. And if you just want to scan this QR code, you can find my contact information. It's going to show you a page like this. You can follow me on social media. And also what I wanted to mention is that we have a survey open on wildfire preparedness, and you can click on it from the first button. And this will really help me and my other colleagues understanding how we can improve, the work in the communities that we do. So if you have time to share, it should be less than 10 minutes. If you want to take it, I would really appreciate it. And thank you. Now it's time for questions.
Our first poll shows that we have 6% of our guests for choice 1. And of course, this is on a scale from 1 to 10. And on 6% otherwise chose 5 out of 10. So we'll go to the next poll question.
Yeah, and thank you, Lisa, for putting the link to the survey also in the chat.
My pleasure. Here's poll number 2.
Lisa, it's not popping up for me. Not sure if anybody else can see the poll.
Can you see it now?
You can see it now.
Thank you. Very good. We'll end the poll. Strongly agree. That's very positive.
I guess we don't have to show the results so people won't feel pressure, with the feedback.
Very good. Okay. can you see untitled poll number 2?
No. Wait. No, I don't see it.
All right. Yeah. It isn't opting for lunch.
Well, if it's too much trouble, maybe we can also like follow up with the poll by email so people can fill it out like later. And now
We
we
should
can,
be able to do that.
okay. So now we can take questions. I see one in the chat.
From Julie.
Yeah, from Julie, we have, are there fire-resistant paints or other products that can be used to good protective advantages on soffits, wooden fences next to houses, wooden patio covers, etc.? So the short answer to this is yes, there are fire-resistant paints that you can, I mean, more than paints are like coatings that you can spray. There are two kinds of coatings, one that lasts only for a few hours, and you just spray on the house before you leave and like before evacuation, you know, and they're not super effective because they have to stay moist. So unless the fire department knows and like keeps them watered, they don't protect your house for that long. And there are other coatings that last for the entire season that you spray, you know, in the beginning of like, I don't know, June or July, and then last until October or November. But you know, those are subject to the weather. So for example, this year we had like the hurricane, so that was not expected. You know, had the rain the middle of the summer, so that's probably gonna wash away most of the retardants that you sprayed around your home. So there are some options out there, but usually you know, are not super effective, or they have limited applicability, and they can be really expensive too. So, and you know, it depends on who sprays it, how they spray it, and so it's not always a guarantee scenario. It's usually good to prepare, you know, passively, like in the same way that people prepare for hurricanes. So we can prepare our house for fires in a way that, you know, we don't have to actively do anything to fight it.
Very good.
I hope this answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Are there other questions you would like to ask Luca at this time? All right. Well, we very much appreciated that you joined us, and we feel that we've really gotten an understanding of how to fire escape in Southern California, which is becoming more and more urgent. I did want to mention to you that we do have a workshop coming up on October 14th. George Spiliotis will join us on native California plants. And to all of you, we thank and have a wonderful weekend. Luca, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Presentation. It's our pleasure.
I know it was a lot of information, but hopefully, you know, something will stick.
Yes, it will. I'm sure we're all running outside to zone 1 right now and make sure we're cleaned up.
Good, because it's the right time of the year too. So
yes.
So thank you everybody for attending the workshop today, and a big thank you, Luca. The information was just great. This was recorded, and so it will be on online at WMWD and also on our VMS Master Gardener page. So we look forward to seeing everybody in October with the presentation. So thank you and have a wonderful day.
Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Luca.